Hi, welcome to this next video tutorial in your general biology course. This session is entitled Energy and Metabolism Part 1. So we've talked about how living things have to harness energy in order to maintain their complex organization. So in these next two videos, we want to see exactly how living things do this. So let's take a look at our learning objectives. The first thing we'll want to do is define energy, get a handle on what that is. Then we'll talk about the laws of thermodynamics that govern the properties of energy and how energy gets transferred around. Specifically, we'll want to look at metabolic reactions, chemical processes going on within cells. We'll look at energy coupling, how cells utilize the energy of one process to fuel another process. And then finally, we'll talk about a substance called ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which we've said is the source of immediate energy in a cell when it's actually doing a task or process that requires energy. All right, so if you recall, we have said that living things have 6 features, and we've talked through some of these, and we've talked about complex organization quite a bit. But in this video, we want to begin looking at that energy processing. Living things require energy to maintain their complex organization. So how do they obtain that energy? Well, here's a little guy obtaining some energy right now. You can watch him shove things into his mouth. He's eating food. He's eating these leaves. And maybe we should ask the question, what is food? Why do living things, whether they're cells or full, complete organisms like this, have to constantly be bringing in food? Well, food might be best described, at least in a biology class, as energy and raw materials. Living things need a constant influx of energy and raw materials. And the simplest form of food that comes into living things is glucose. We have said glucose, which is a carbohydrate, it's a monosaccharide. Glucose is our short-term energy storage molecule. And sure enough, glucose is energy and raw materials. The raw materials are fairly easy to recognize. That's the atoms that make up the glucose. The molecular formula of glucose is C6H12O6. So there are 6 atoms of carbon, 12 atoms of hydrogen, and 6 atoms of oxygen in that glucose. So that's the raw materials, the actual atoms. But where is the energy in the glucose? Well, in our figure, the energy is represented by the black lines connecting the atoms. We would call those chemical bonds. Now, there aren't actual sticks connecting the atoms, as the picture might suggest. The atoms are simply positioned near each other, but those bonds that are forming between the atoms are the sources of energy. Chemical bonds represent a type of stored, or as we'll call it later, potential energy. Well, where did the energy in the glucose come from? Well, we've alluded to this a little bit as well. Plants and algae and some bacteria are photosynthetic. They're autotrophs, self-food makers. And these autotrophic or photosynthetic organisms can harness sunlight. Sunlight is a form of energy, and they can use that energy to assemble the glucose, something that takes place in the chloroplast, as we mentioned in a previous video. So the plants are harnessing solar energy and using it to assemble carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen into glucose. So now the plant has access to that glucose energy. It's making its own food. But we've also said that animals will require glucose. They can't make it directly from sunlight, so they're going to eat the plant to get the glucose. That's exactly what the monkey was doing in that video. And then other types of organisms have ways of obtaining the glucose as well. This mosquito, for example, is drinking the blood of an organism that has probably obtained glucose by eating a plant. Or maybe this lion is eating the zebra to get the glucose that the zebra obtained by eating the grass. So one way or another, the energy comes in as sunlight, but then it gets transferred through the entire ecosystem as a source of energy and raw materials. And living things will eventually die, but even dead things can provide food or energy and raw materials for other living things. These fungi are decomposers. They're breaking down this dead log to obtain the glucose, the energy and raw materials that the fungi needs to grow. So one way or another, it all seems to hinge on glucose as a short-term energy molecule. But how much food does an organism eat? The monkey that we saw just a minute ago in that video probably eats a few thousand pounds of food in its lifetime. You have probably eaten a few thousand pounds of food in your lifetime, but clearly you don't weigh a few thousand pounds. So where is all of this food going that comes into the living thing? Well, to answer that, I want to show you this structure here. Think about the last time that you took a bath, and when you let the water out, it started going down the drain, and maybe you saw a vortex form like this. And maybe you saw it and then you got out and didn't give it a second thought. But I want you to realize now that that vortex is actually a very good analogy for living things and the processing of food. This vortex is what physicists would call a dissipative structure. Now, what that means is that it's formed and maintained by a continuous flow of energy and materials. So every time you look at that vortex as it's going down the drain, it looks pretty similar. It's got that triangular shape to it. So its structure, its three-dimensional shape, seems to be remaining fairly constant. But you realize that the water molecules that comprise it are being updated every second because that water is flowing through the vortex and eventually down the drain. So there's got to be more water always at the top coming into it. As the existing water flows through it, it becomes the vortex, and then it leaves the vortex as more and more water flows through. So clearly there are water molecules, that's material, funneling themselves or dissipating through this. But what about the energy? The vortex forms because of the gravitational force that's pulling the water down the drain. And by moving into this triangular cone shape, which is also spinning, by the way, that becomes the most efficient way to dissipate that force and the water down the drain. So the vortex will continue to exist so long as there is water in the tub, material, and a force, gravity, creating that energetic flow. And I'm going to suggest that you are a lot like this vortex. You are a dissipative structure. So every day you look in the mirror and you look pretty similar, but the reality is you exchange gazillions of molecules with the world and the environment every time you ingest things, every time you urinate or sweat or exhale or defecate. So food is flowing through you as energy and materials, much the same way energy and materials flow through this vortex. Eventually the vortex will die when that flow stops, in the same way that living things eventually die when they stop funneling energy and raw materials through them. Well, we need to think about what energy is. I think you've probably got a pretty good grasp on raw materials, but what is energy? Well, energy is actually pretty hard to define. One thing I've always wanted to do in class is get me a mayonnaise jar or something and fill it with pure energy, nothing but energy, so I could then bring it into the class and pass it around and let students see what pure energy looks like. The problem is I've never figured out how to put just energy into that jar, because energy is not a thing per se. It has no volume or mass. It's the capacity to do work. So it's the capacity. Capacity is the potential to do something. And you just can't hold that in your hand purely by itself. So what do we mean by the capacity to do work? How could we measure that? Well, the way they measure that in physics is they say it's the capacity to move a mass a distance. For example, if I have a baseball and I throw it at a chair, the flying baseball has the capacity to move the chair a certain distance. When the baseball hits the chair, that chair may slide just a few inches. So that baseball clearly had energy. It had the capacity to move the mass, the chair, a particular distance. So that's in a physics class. Let's look at an example then, maybe from physics. Here we see some billiard balls. Each one of them has a mass. They're not moving right now, but what if we hit the cue ball into this? What if we give the cue ball some energy? We give the cue ball some capacity to do work, And as it comes in, you can tell the cue ball had energy because it in fact moved those masses a certain amount of distance. The greater they moved, the more energy the cue ball must have had in the first place. So that's a good physics example of what energy might look like. But what about in living things? How could we think about energy here? Well, living things we know require energy to do things like movement. The cell is moving around, and although the cell is tiny, it does have a mass, and so some energy must have been involved to get the cell to move. So flagella and cilia and pseudopods require energy because they ultimately move the cell around. Another type of energy at the cellular level and of life is active transport, which we've talked about in a previous video. If you're going to move a substance up a gradient, so to speak, kind of like the truck moving up the hill, we said that's going to require energy. Endo and exocytosis also require energy. These were examples of bulk transport. So if we're going to build pseudopods around an object to pull it in, or if we're going to move a vesicle to the membrane to secrete something out, that's going to require energy. But the one we're going to focus on the most in the next video for that matter are chemical reactions, because cells in some sense are incredibly complicated chemical factories, constantly making substances, breaking down substances. A lot of the activities that we call life are, in essence, incredibly complex chemical reactions taking place. So we're going to look a lot at chemical reactions. But before we get into that, we've got to come up with a unit of energy. If we're going to talk about the amount of energy it takes to do something, we're going to need a unit that we can use to describe it. Just like we use the unit of a meter to describe length or a gram to describe mass, we need a unit of energy. And that unit is called the calorie. If you've taken a chemistry class, you may have learned of another unit called a joule. But for one reason or another, biologists tend to still be hanging on to the unit of calorie. To be honest, joule is probably the better unit, but biologists still seem to be using calorie for the most part. So what is a calorie? Well, a calorie is the amount of energy required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. So I could put a thermometer down into this water to see what its temperature is. When you put a thermometer in there, what you're really going to be measuring is molecular motion. And as you're probably aware, as you heat up things, that increases molecular motion. So if we can add enough energy to increase the molecular motion so the thermometer goes up by 1 degree Celsius, then we've added a calorie's worth of energy. And that's actually a fair amount of energy because it takes a fair amount to make water's temperature change. Recall that water molecules are all clinging to each other via hydrogen bonds, those weak electrostatic clings. And so as we add energy, the molecules want to move faster, but they're clinging to their neighbors. So we've got to add enough energy to begin breaking those hydrogen bonds. And once we've added enough so that 1 gram of water, which by the way is about 1 good-sized drop of water, when a gram of water's temperature goes up by 1 degree, we have added by definition a calorie's worth of energy. Remember, energy is the capacity to do work or to move a mass a distance. Water molecules are kind of like billiard balls. They have a mass. So if we're adding energy and making them move, which causes the temperature to rise, then we can quantify this, and that's the calorie. Now, I said that's a fair amount, but we usually measure things in terms of what are called kilocalories or kcals. And a kilocalorie is simply 1,000 of these calories. And the other thing I want you to notice is that I'm using the lowercase c to define that calorie. What you're probably more familiar with is what we call a food calorie, and a food calorie is a capital C. And a food calorie is the same thing as a kilocalorie. So 1 kilocalorie, or 1,000 little c calories, is the same thing as 1 capital C food calorie. And these terms came up in a previous video because we talked about carbohydrates being a way to store energy and that there were 4 kilocalories per gram in carbohydrates. And you might recall there were 9 kilocalories per gram in lipids, which is why we use lipids for long-term energy storage. All right, so we've got a unit for measuring energy, the calorie. Now let's point out that there are really 2 forms that energy can take. And the first form that energy can take is called kinetic energy. And this is the type that's probably most intuitive to us because this is energy of motion. Just a minute ago, I mentioned that a baseball flying through the air has the capacity to do work. If it strikes a chair, for example, it can make that chair move. It can make a mass move. So obviously, any mass that is in motion has kinetic energy. So we think of kinetic energy as the energy of motion. Some good examples would be the flying baseball, like we see here, or a speeding car. About a year ago, I was sitting in my car at a traffic light, minding my own business, and I looked up into my rearview mirror and I saw a mass in motion. I saw another car coming at me from behind, and I realized that the mass of that car is pretty big, plus it's got a fair amount of velocity or speed. It had a lot of kinetic energy. And my concern was that that kinetic energy was about to be transferred to my car. And sure enough, it happened. I was a big mass, but that car moved my car a certain amount of distance because of the amount of kinetic energy that car had. Now, some other examples of kinetic energy that might be a little less intuitive are heat. We were just talking about that when you add heat to this water, it makes those little molecules, those little billiard balls, move faster. So that means the water molecules now have kinetic energy, a lot like the flying baseball has kinetic energy. The flying baseball is just a bigger mass. Sunlight is a form of kinetic energy. Sunlight consists of a lot of photon particles which have almost no mass, but they're moving at the speed of light. And so they compensate for their lack of mass by their great amount of motion, their great velocity. Same thing with electricity. You've got electrons with almost no mass, but they do have a mass, and they are in motion, again, moving at the speed of light. So the amount of kinetic energy is sort of a product of the amount of mass and the speed. So the sunlight and the electricity make up for their lack of mass by having lots of velocity or speed. So here's some sunlight coming into the ecosystem. And again, we said this is where energy begins in life. It comes in as sunlight. We need the sun to constantly be bombarding the earth with this kinetic energy. And then plants and algae and other things have figured out how to harness that kinetic energy of sunlight and put it into glucose molecules. And that leads us to our second type of energy, which is potential energy. Kinetic energy is energy of motion. Potential energy is energy of position. Some people call it stored energy. So a good example would be this rock sitting on a cliff. This rock is not moving. It has a lot of mass, but it's not in motion, so it doesn't actually have kinetic energy. But because of its position, because it's teetering on the top of a cliff way above the ground level, it has a lot of potential energy. In fact, if we gave it a nudge, that mass would suddenly be in motion and would have the capacity to do an awful lot of work on anything in its path. Now, another good example of potential or stored energy is a compressed spring. So when you compress the spring is not moving, but there's a lot of energy invested in its position. Some less obvious or intuitive examples of potential energy would be a gradient or a chemical bond. An example of a gradient would be the battery. We've talked about this just a little bit in an earlier video when we were talking about why cells would use active transport to create gradients. We said gradients can store energy, and this battery is a good example. There's a gradient, there's an unequal distribution of charge. That's why we have a negative end and a positive end. And at the moment, the charge can't really go anywhere, and so it's stored in the battery. The battery has a lot of potential energy. We could later connect that wire between the two poles and allow the particles, the electrons, to flow and move, and now those electrons would have kinetic energy, energy of motion. And a chemical bond is also a great example of potential energy. If we think about the compressed spring for a second, that's energy of position. You're investing energy into its shape or its structure, and that's a very good metaphor or analogy for what happens when we form a chemical bond. You're investing energy into their position. These two oxygen atoms are very, very close to each other, and to get them that close, it's almost like compressing the spring. So now, even though the oxygen atoms may not necessarily be moving, their position relative to each other, the chemical bond between them, represents stored energy. And just as I can let go of the spring and release its energy, we can break the chemical bond and release the stored potential energy as kinetic energy. Let's look at another interesting example of potential energy. So this person has drawn the bow and it's got an arrow in it. And as they stand there, there is no motion right now. So there is no kinetic energy in this picture. But you know there's a lot of stress and tension in that bowstring and even in the bow itself where it's bent. So there's a lot of energy invested into the position or the structure that we see here. So there's a lot of potential energy, but when he lets go of the string, we know that the arrow starts flying off, a mass in motion with a lot of capacity to do work. In other words, the potential energy in the picture on the left has become the kinetic energy invested in the arrow in the picture on the right. So that's interesting. What that tells us is that potential energy can be converted or transferred or transformed into kinetic energy. The energy of the string can be passed into the arrow. And the person in the picture is hoping that a lot of energy gets transferred from the bowstring into the arrow because that will make the arrow fly faster. And maybe he's trying to do work on a deer or something that's being hunted. It also explains why you should never shoot a dry bow, if you're familiar with that concept. You're never supposed to pull a bow back if there's not an arrow in it. And the reason for that is that when you let go of the string, there is no arrow to transfer all that potential energy into, and that energy has to go somewhere, so it dissipates through the string, through the bow. It makes the bow shake violently. Your arm will shake violently because that energy has to go somewhere. In fact, all of this is leading us to a discussion of what we call the laws of thermodynamics that govern how energy gets passed around and transferred. And there are two laws of thermodynamics, and I suspect you've heard of these if you've had another type of science class previously. So the first law of thermodynamics says that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, although it can be transferred and transformed. And that's a pretty interesting and profound statement. What it's saying is the amount of energy in the universe is a constant. There's a certain amount of it, and we cannot create more of it, nor can we destroy that which exists. And that's a pretty philosophically profound statement as well, because remember, energy is not even a thing. It's not a material thing with mass or volume. It's a capacity. It's like the potential to do something. And we're saying that that capacity, there's a finite amount of that potential or capacity in the universe that's always been the same. There has always been this great amount of capacity. There's the same amount today. It simply gets transferred and transformed. The second law of thermodynamics says that energy cannot be transferred or transformed with 100% efficiency. In other words, some energy will always be lost as heat and increase the entropy of the universe. Entropy refers to the disorder, the disorganization, the randomness. So if we go back to the bow and arrow, it says that we have a certain amount of potential energy in the bow when it's drawn, which we just said we're going to pass or transfer to the arrow. Not only are we transferring it, we're transforming it because it's going from potential to kinetic. Those are different forms. And we're transferring it from the bow to the arrow. But what the second law says is that when you do that, you cannot transfer it with 100% efficiency. We cannot put all of the potential energy of the bow into the arrow. Some energy will be lost as heat and increase the entropy of the universe. So when he let go of the arrow, it goes flying, and actually a little bit of heat comes off of the bow and the arrow when he lets go of the string. For that matter, as the arrow is flying through the air and moving air molecules out of the way, doing work on them, a little bit of heat is also being dissipated out of that as well. So you can never transfer or transform energy with 100% efficiency. Now notice we're saying that this energy is lost as heat. We're not saying destroyed. The energy just goes into the random movement of particles in the universe. And this is also a philosophically profound statement because it also implies that the universe is constantly moving towards disorder, towards greater entropy. Those are some pretty big ideas that are probably best discussed in a physics class. So we'll move on from that, but let's look at an example of some energy transfers and transformations. Here is a batter who's about to swing at a pitch. So the ball's about to come flying towards him. The ball, as we've already implied, is a mass in motion. So the ball has a certain amount of kinetic energy. But the batter is about to start swinging the bat. The bat also has mass, and he's going to put it in motion. So the bat will also have kinetic energy. And then we need to think about what happens when the bat actually hits the ball. There will be an interesting transfer. The bat will be transferring its energy to the ball, and it turns out the bat has more than the ball has, so the ball's direction is going to change, and it's going to start moving in a different direction. You also need to think about the heat that will be released when the bat hits the ball. So here comes the ball in. The ball's got kinetic energy. The bat's got kinetic energy. There's the transfer. Some heat was dissipated away. And that's just to talk about the bat and the ball. We haven't even begun to discuss his muscles, and he is a living thing, and the energy and fuel in his body that has to be converted into the kinetic motion of his legs moving and him heading towards first base. So there's just all kinds of energy transfers and transformations taking place in that scene. Now another good example of energy transfer and transformation is your car. So you have to put gasoline in your car, and that gasoline has got potential energy in it. There's a lot of energy invested in the bonds holding all that carbon and hydrogen together. And you're going to try to release that energy by oxidizing the gasoline, by combusting it and breaking it down into carbon dioxide and water. And when the gasoline is combusted, we're going to try to convert that energy released from that combustion into the kinetic motion of your car, making the wheels turn and the car move. And my question for you is, how efficient do you think that energy conversion is? We know that we cannot convert all of the energy in the gasoline, the bond energy, into kinetic energy. That's both a transformation and a transfer. We can't do all of it. The second law tells us that. But what efficiency can we do it at? And it turns out that the car engine is approximately 30% efficient, which means of all the energy invested in the bonds of the gasoline, 30% of it becomes motion, whereas 70% is lost as heat. You can see it in the figure there. It's coming off the engine. This is why you need a radiator, and you've got to have fans and all these ways to cool your engine, because the engine's only 30% efficient, and an enormous amount of energy is just going towards the randomness and disorder and entropy of the universe. So that's a car. That's kind of a modern combustion engine. What about a cell? What about a living cell? Do you think it is more efficient or less efficient than a car? We know the cell has its own gasoline, so to speak. That's the glucose molecule. But when it converts that into, say, motion, is it more or less efficient than a human-designed car engine? Well, I don't know what your guess is, but I'll just go ahead and give you the answer. Cells are approximately 40% efficient, and 60% of the fuel energy, like the energy that came in as glucose, is lost as heat. You've got great firsthand experience with this if you've ever exercised or gone through a workout. So you're sitting there on the treadmill or on the bicycle, and your legs are moving, your arms are moving, and you can tell your body's heating up, you're starting to sweat, and you're giving off heat because you're converting the food you ate that day, your fuel, into the motion to do the running or the cycling. But about 60% of that food energy is being released out of your body as body heat. And that's why we have to sweat to try to more efficiently get that heat away from our bodies. So we are also at the mercy of the second law of thermodynamics. So we've been talking a lot about this energy being transferred and transformed and moved around. A scientist back in the 1800s, Willard Gibbs, gave us a method for quantifying and measuring and understanding the amount of energy that's being transferred and transformed. He developed a method of measuring energy transformations in chemical reactions. And he's a person that you probably talk about in a chemistry class, but he's also very important for our discussion in our biology class. The amount of energy that is transferred or transformed in a chemical reaction is often referred to as Gibbs free energy, named after Willard Gibbs. And we usually abbreviate the quantity with the capital letter G. So this Gibbs free energy is a measure of the amount of energy that's being transferred and transformed in a chemical process. And we'll look at free energy here in just a moment, but first let's think about the chemical processes that are going on within cells and in living things. We call those processes metabolism. So metabolism is the sum of all the biochemical reactions that are occurring in a cell. And it turns out there are essentially two types of reactions taking place in the cell. They're called catabolic reactions and anabolic reactions. So let's look at these two types of metabolic processes in a little bit more detail. We'll start with catabolic reactions. Catabolic reactions are sometimes referred to as decomposition reactions. In other words, taking apart or breaking down. Maybe you have some substance Z and you want to break it down and do simpler substances X and Y. You want to take it apart. Well, that involves breaking some bonds. If you're going to disassemble Z into X and Y, you're going to have to break some of the bonds that are holding Z together. And we have said that chemical bonds represent stored potential energy. So if you're breaking the bonds, you're releasing energy. And the term for that is exergonic. Exergonic means that the process is releasing energy, and that's what we would see if Z is breaking down into X and Y. Now, the other type of metabolic process going on in cells would be anabolic reactions, and these are sometimes thought of as synthetic reactions. So we're synthesizing, we're building, or we're forming something. Maybe we've got a substance A and B, and we want to combine them together to form C. Well, that means we have to build a bond between A and B to make C. And anytime you build a bond, you have to supply the energy to form that bond. And so these reactions are called endergonic because they require energy. Energy has to be supplied to make that process happen. So catabolic and anabolic, you're either taking things apart or building them up, and you're either releasing energy or you're having to supply or provide the energy for that. So let's look at these processes from the energy standpoint again for just a second. So Z is breaking down into X and Y, and we see energy being released. Well, we could graph that energy transformation and talk about it in terms of Gibbs free energy. So here's a graph, and on the y-axis, we're plotting the Gibbs free energy, the amount of energy that's present in the system. So notice that we're starting with substance Z, which has a large amount of free energy in it. But as the reaction proceeds, we end up with products that don't have as much free energy. And so where did the excess go? Where did that extra go? Well, it was released. So G went from a higher value to a lower value, and the only way for that to happen is to lose free energy. So there is a negative change in G. That triangle is the Greek letter delta, and it means change. So the change in G is negative. We're going down. We're losing energy. Now let's compare that to an endergonic process where A and B are being combined to form C, and we're having to supply the energy to make that happen. Again, we could graph it. So we see the reactants A and B have a lower amount of energy than the product C does. And so for this to happen, we have to invest or supply that energy. So the G, the Gibbs free energy, is increasing. It's going up. It's going from the value that it had with A and B up to the value that it has with C. So the change is positive. It's an increase in free energy. So when you see a negative delta G, that tells you energy is being released. When you see a positive delta G, that tells you that energy is being added or supplied or invested into the system. Let's look at some, instead of dealing with letters, let's think about some actual reactions that might display these properties. So here is a great example of an exergonic reaction. There were some logs that were full of starch and cellulose, these energy molecules that we associate with plants. So the log was full of polymers of glucose. But the log could be ignited and it begins to oxidize, breaking the glucose down into simpler substances, carbon dioxide and water. So it's an exergonic event. Z is glucose, X and Y are carbon dioxide and water, and we're releasing energy. In fact, the delta G is so great, the amount of energy is so great, you can literally see it in this picture. The flames coming off is the energy literally being released as the glucose is broken down into carbon dioxide and water. So a great example of an exergonic process. You can literally see the energy being released. Now a good example of an endergonic process would be photosynthesis. So in this picture, you can't see it as literally, but sunlight is arriving. Sunlight is a form of energy, and the plant is going to harness it and use it to do an A plus B makes C. It's going to take carbon dioxide and water and put them together to form glucose. And so that's an endergonic or an energetically uphill process. And it's these endergonic and anabolic processes that are so unique to living things. Non-living things can do catabolic and exergonic reactions. We know a rock can decompose and break down. What rocks can't do is harness energy to make more complicated things. Rocks cannot, on their own, harness energy to turn themselves into castles, these highly structured, organized things. We know a rock can break down, but it can't do energetically uphill things. But life seems to be able to figure out how to do this, which is fascinating because the laws of thermodynamics would, at least initially, suggest that you can't go towards greater complexity, towards higher energy levels. Endergonic reactions are going towards higher energy levels, and the laws of thermodynamics would suggest that everything's going to lower energy levels. So what is life doing to defy the laws of thermodynamics? Well, to be honest, life is not defying the laws of thermodynamics. It's just found a fascinating loophole in the laws of thermodynamics. And let's look at that. So let's say a cell needs to do this process. A plus B makes C. And this process requires energy. It has a positive delta G. It's energetically uphill. In fact, let's use some actual numbers. Let's say that the change in G is plus 40 kilocalories per mole. You have to provide 40 kilocalories worth of energy to make this happen. Well, where can the cell get that? Well, it could get it from an exergonic process. It could take Z breaking down into X and Y and let the energy released from that funnel into A plus B makes C. And as long as the amount of energy released is more than the bottom reaction requires, this should work. Let's say that the top reaction has a delta G of minus 100 kilocalories per mole. We know it's going to be negative because it's releasing energy. Well, if this reaction releases 100 units of energy and we funnel 40 of them into the bottom reaction, we'll still have some energy left over. This is called energy coupling, where the energy released from an exergonic process is used to fuel an endergonic process. And we could ask how much energy is left over. Well, it's just simple math. If we release 100 and you take 40 of that to invest into C, you'll still be releasing 60. So the delta G for the process is still negative. And by the way, I don't think I said this yet, but anytime you have a negative delta G, that reaction is also considered spontaneous. Spontaneous means that it's energetically favorable, that the laws of physics kind of allow this. It follows those laws of thermodynamics without any problem. Any reaction that has a negative delta G is going to be spontaneous because you're going to a lower energy state. The A plus B makes C is not spontaneous, but if we couple it to the Z breakdown to X and Y and think of it as one big reaction, then the entire process collectively is spontaneous, and the cell, next thing you know, is turning A's and B's into C's. So this also explains why cells have to constantly be bringing in food, because Z represents food. And the cell will break the food down to get the energy out of it and then use that energy to do all of the day-to-day, minute-to-minute processes that require energy. And so energy coupling is what life has figured out and rocks have yet to figure out. Let the energy of an exergonic process fuel the endergonic process. And as long as the exergonic process releases more than the endergonic one requires, coupled together, the entire process remains exergonic. We've lost 60 units of energy. That's the heat given off going towards greater randomness and disorder in the universe, but it's still an energetically downhill and therefore spontaneous process. All right, that's still dealing with A's and B's and Z's and stuff. Let's get more specific and look at some actual reactions that take place in cells. Now, we have said that the short-term energy molecule that life uses is glucose. So I've put glucose in red there because that's where a lot of energy is trapped and invested in its bond structures. But we can perform an exergonic process. A cell can break the glucose, the Z, down into carbon dioxide and water. And doing that will release energy. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and give you the delta G for this. It's a good number to know. The delta G for the breakdown of glucose into carbon dioxide and water is negative 686. I'm not worrying about units anymore here. In chemistry class, we probably have to be more obsessed with units. Let's just think in terms of quantities. The delta G is negative 686 kilocalories per mole. That's a lot of energy being released. And the cell can harness that energy and use it to build ATP molecules. We've said glucose is short-term energy storage, but ATP is the immediate energy source in a cell. So what a cell's going to do is take the energy out of the glucose and use it to build the ATP. Now, if you look at that, that's kind of an A plus B makes C reaction. It's energetically uphill. It has a positive delta G. And if we're going to build 36 of these ATP molecules, the delta G is plus 263. But we need to think of these two processes as coupled. Let the exergonic fuel the endergonic. So if we think of them together as one process, ask yourself, what is the overall change in energy? And again, it's just simple math. We've got $686 available to us. We want to buy something that costs $263. We'll still have $423 left over and change. So the coupled process is exergonic and spontaneous. This is essentially what happens in your mitochondria. We convert the glucose energy into the ATP energy, the short-term storage into the immediate storage. So now we've got this ATP battery that can supply the energy for some reaction taking place in the cell. So the cell can say, well, I'm going to now use this energy in the ATP to drive some sort of a process. So the ATP can be broken back down into ADP and phosphate. That will release energy. If you're only doing it with one ATP, the delta G is negative 7.3. So we've got 7.3 units worth of energy to work with. And that's a pretty good number because most of the reactions that take place in a cell that we associate with life only require fairly small amounts of energy. A good example is this reaction. Carbon dioxide plus ammonia makes urea. This is what you're doing in your liver right now. You're taking your carbon dioxide waste, combining it with ammonia waste that you've generated to form a substance called urea, which you know better as urine. So when you urinate, you're trying to get rid of your carbon dioxide and ammonia waste. They've formed this substance called urea, but putting the CO2 and ammonia together requires energy. It's energetically uphill. In fact, its delta G is about 3.2. But we got 7.3 available. So if we couple these processes, let the negative delta G fuel the positive delta G, we'll still have negative 4.1 as the delta G. We got $7.30 to buy a $3.20 reaction. We'll still have $4.10 left over. So it's exergonic, and we have made the formation of urea spontaneous. Now, I should point out that there's still energy in the urea. We took it out of the ATP molecule and used the energy to form the bonds of the urea. We can't do any of this with 100% efficiency. So when you take it out of the glucose to put it into the ATP, you can't do that with 100% efficiency. You're losing 423 units of energy. When you take it out of the ATP and put it in the urea, can't do that with 100% efficiency. So you're losing 4.1. When you flush the toilet, the urea now goes down the drain and out into the environment somewhere, and bacteria out there are going to be terribly excited at the thought of your urine coming at them because they can take the energy out of the urea and put it into something else. They can continue this chain of energy transfer. So the next time you go to the bathroom, before you hit the flush, I would encourage you to, at least for a few moments, stand there and just bask in the glow of energy coupling, because this is what drives everything in life and ecosystems. But I do want to ask an interesting question. Why did we introduce ATP into this story? Why not just let the energy come out of the glucose and funnel directly into the formation of urea? Why not let glucose breakdown directly fuel urea formation? In this example here, we took it out of the glucose and put it into a middleman. We put it into ATP, only to then take it out of the ATP and put it in the urea. So we want to ask the question, why ATP? Well, first thing we need to do is figure out what ATP is exactly. So I've told you that it stands for adenosine triphosphate, and here's what the ATP molecule looks like. It's actually a nucleotide. I think we mentioned that in a previous video. And ATP has got a lot of energy in it because chemical bonds represent potential stored energy. But to be honest, all the energy we care about in this molecule is what's invested in the third phosphate, adenosine triphosphate, adenosine with 3 phosphate groups on it. And this is the bond that matters, the bond that holds that phosphate on. You need to realize that not all chemical bonds contain the same amount of energy. It doesn't take the same amount of energy to get 2 carbons near each other as it takes to get a carbon and an oxygen near each other, for example. So not all bonds contain the same amount, and it turns out that the bond holding this third phosphate group on is a very high energy bond. And the reason there's so much energy invested in it is because we're trying to put 3 negative charged things near each other. Notice that each phosphate has a negative charge. The one on the end has 2 negative charges. And you've probably learned somewhere that opposite charges attract, but like charges repel. So when we're trying to bring that third phosphate on there and form a bond, it doesn't want to be there. It's very repelled by the other negative charges already present. So you've got to invest enormous amounts of energy to get that phosphate on. So it's a very high energy bond. What that means is that when we break the bond, you get that energy out, which is a fairly decent amount. So let's see that happen. We're going to break that bond. The ATP is going to break down into adenosine diphosphate, and we've got the phosphate that got knocked off. So when we break the bond, we release the energy, and for one bond, that's a lot. The negative 7.3 is actually quite a bit of energy for a single bond to have been broken. So it's a nice amount. It's a lot for one bond, but it's also the amount that's very appropriate for other types of chemical processes that we're going to try to fuel that with. So one nice thing about ATP is we get a lot of energy by breaking one bond. Another advantage of this is that once the ATP has been broken down into the ADP and phosphate, that can be recycled. We can send the ADP and phosphate to a mitochondria and just put the phosphate back on there. So it's recyclable. It's like a rechargeable battery. So if we want to ask this question, why ATP, the first thing we might mention is the efficiency of the energy coupling. Recall that when breaking down glucose, we're releasing 686 units. The urea reaction only required a little over 3 units. So if we try to buy a $3 reaction with $686, we're going to be wasting an enormous amount of energy. It's very inefficient. But by trading our high dollar glucose into a bunch of smaller dollar ATPs, we can spend those very efficiently. We'll spend $7.30 to buy a $3 reaction. We'll only waste $4 in that, if you recall. So ATP allows for much more efficient energy coupling. But then, as we've also alluded to, it's a very simple process. We only have to break one bond, and we get a very usable amount of energy that can drive an awful lot of chemical events in the cell. And then finally, we said that ATP is recyclable. Once the ATP is broken down, it can be put back into ATP by coupling that to glucose breakdown. So you have a gazillion ATP molecules in your body, but you don't have to eat ATP. You just keep reusing the existing ones that you have. It's the glucose that has to keep coming into our bodies and be broken down and exhaled out as carbon dioxide and water. So that brings us a little bit back to this dissipative structure. We said that this vortex forms because we have material and energy that form a structure, and then the material and the energy flow or dissipate through it continuously. And that's a lot like what cells or what life is, with glucose coming in, breaking the energy down, the atoms and so forth being part of the living thing until those things are broken down and it flowing through. But I want to show you another pictorial metaphor or analogy for this dissipative structure, and that's this system right here. So here we've got a closed system. We've got a container of water on the left and what began as an empty container on the right, and we had a gradient. You can literally see the unequal distribution of the water. There's more on the left than the right, and because we have a gradient, the energy of that will flow through the system as the water moves to the other side. It turns our little turbine engine, and that's why the light bulb has lit up. So the change in G here is negative. We're going downhill energetically. It's spontaneous. It's going to happen. The problem with this is that it's a closed system. So if we let this play out, we eventually arrive at a state of equilibrium. So now the closed system has reached equilibrium, and we have no more gradients. We have no more delta G's, changes or gradients of G that we can take advantage of. It's as if the system has died and we can't get anything out of it. So it's a good analogy to the vortex, because eventually the water in the tub completely goes through the drain, and now there's neither energy or raw materials to work with. We've reached equilibrium. Everything's sort of died, if you want to use that word. Life cannot be a closed system like this. So the better pictorial metaphor for life would be an open system. So if you look at this system, we've got an opening at both ends. Up here, we've got more energy and materials entering the system, and we've got a gradient of energy from the first container to the second, so we get the light bulb going. But the second one still has a bit of a gradient compared to the third, so the next light bulb lights up. We've still got a little bit of a gradient between the third and the fourth, so that light bulb is lighting up. We're getting some energy out of that. But at the bottom, the system is draining. That prevents the last container from filling up and hitting equilibrium with the container next to it. So as long as we have more energy and materials coming in at the top where the faucet is, and as long as we're releasing energy and raw materials at the bottom where the drain opening is, this system remains alive continuously. So an open system continuously dissipates energy and raw materials. Now the metaphor for this would be the faucet at the top is the sun, bringing in the energy, and then raw materials can be harnessed as well. And then the energy gets incorporated into life and it flows through the living system. Think of that as a food chain if you want to, but the whole ecosystem remains living even as carbon dioxide and water and energy are dissipating out at the bottom end. So this picture to me is a really fascinating analogy or metaphor for how ecosystems and how living things function. If we turn off the faucet or if we clog up the drain at the other end, we're going to be in big trouble and hit some sort of equilibrium state, and death will rise. So look at that picture and see if that reminds you of this picture, because it's essentially the same thing. So again, we've got energy and raw materials in the form of glucose at the top end. We can take it out of there, put it into the ATP, take it out of the ATP, put it into the urea. It's just flowing through the system, a lot like that hydroelectric system that we just saw in the previous picture. All right, that brings us to the end of Energy and Metabolism Part 1. In our next video, we're going to have to move beyond the concept of spontaneous, the idea that a reaction is energetically favorable and downhill, and ask the question about instantaneous. How fast will the reaction occur, and is there something we're going to have to do to catalyze or speed up the reactions? In other words, we're going to talk about enzymes. But that's what we'll get into in the next video, so we'll see you then.